All right, good afternoon. We're going to start with the Pledge of Allegiance. So if you please stand and join me. Ready? Begin. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. At this time, I'd like to call the meeting to order. Individuals wishing to address the City Council are requested to complete a speaker card and deliver it to the City Clerk staff prior to the item being heard by the City Council. Please observe a 3-minute time limit for communications, and once called upon to speak, please state your name and city of residence for the record. There has been a revision to the agenda. Item number 2 has some revisions to the presentation. Communications from the public. This portion of the agenda is intended for the general public comment on items within the council's jurisdiction that are not listed elsewhere on the agenda. Please note the state law prohibits the City Council from discussing or taking action on these items. Please observe a 3-minute time limit for comments, and once called upon to speak, please state your name and city of residence for the record. Ms. Edwards, are there any speaker cards from the public?
Mayor, we do not have any speaker cards.
Thank you. Okay, agenda item 1 is an overview on the implementation of Senate Bill 6 and Assembly Bill 2011. Joanne Coletta, Planning and Development Director, will present this item.
Thank you and good afternoon. As you stated, really the presentation here today is to really give the council an update on some legislation, specifically housing legislation that is going to go into effect on July 1. And I also want to go over with you staff's recommendation on how to best implement this legislation. So really the recommendation today, and really what we want the council to think about as we're going through this presentation, is to allow staff to apply the city's affordable housing overlay zone requirements when it comes to allowing housing in commercial zones that would be allowed by Senate Bill 6. I will also be touching on Assembly Bill 2011, as you mentioned, but specifically this request will only cover Senate Bill 6. And as I walk through this presentation, you'll understand why. And also keep in the back of your mind, the city does have that affordable housing overlay zone that was adopted as part of our housing element. And in that requirement, it does require that at least 20% of the total housing units within a mixed income project be set aside for low income units. So Senate Bill 6 is known as the Middle Class Housing Act of 2022, and Assembly Bill 2011 is known as the Affordable Housing and High Roads Jobs Act of 2022. Both of these bills were signed by the governor in September of 2022 and are scheduled to go into effect July 1st of this year. I do want to remind the City Council that the staff did submit letters of opposition to both of these bills at the time they were being considered. But as you can see, any opposition to these bills did not resonate with state lawmakers, and the governor did go ahead and sign those bills into law. So now we are preparing them to become effective here in the next couple of months. So just a high-level overview of Senate Bill 6, what this bill basically does, it does allow housing to be on property that is zoned to allow office, retail, or parking. So it's mostly your commercial zones. And in this bill, there is no affordable housing requirement. And there are 2 types of projects that can be done. It can be a residential only project, or it can be a mixed use development project. And if it's mixed use, the bill does stipulate that 50% or more of the square footage in a mixed-use project must be set aside for residential, and no lodging facilities are allowed, such as a hotel or motel, so that needs to be separated from this project. A site must be at least 20 acres or less, and the density can be no less than 30 dwelling units to the acre. There's also the stipulation that a housing site cannot be adjacent to a site where 1/3 of the square footage is dedicated to industrial. And additionally, the city is to apply objective development standards, and we are to use the zoning that would apply to a density of 30 dwelling units to the acre. And in our particular case, that would be an R3 zoning, which is a high-density residential designation. So basically, you do not have to change the zoning on property to allow housing under SB 6. So for example, if the property is zoned C3 and somebody says, I'm coming in and exercising SB 6, they don't have to come in and apply for a general plan amendment or a change of zone. We have to then take the zoning standard that we have that's applicable to the density of 30 dwelling units to the acre, and that is the zoning standard that we would apply to the property. AB 2011 is very similar to SB 6. However, there are some slight differences, so I just want to highlight what those differences are. In this bill, it does require affordable housing. And the two types of housing projects that you can have a 100% affordable residential unit project, or you can have a mixed income housing project. And that means you can have a mix of affordable with market rate housing, as long as there is a percentage set aside for lower density. And I will go over that with the council. Additionally, no site can be within 500 feet of a freeway under this bill. And also a site, also for this bill, a site that's being used for housing, 75% of that perimeter does need to be adjacent to urban uses. The same objective development standards would apply in this case. However, this bill does have some specific development standards that the city would have to apply for a mixed income housing project if the city's development standards are more restrictive, and it actually works in the vice versa as well. If our standards are less restrictive than what the bill is, then the city would use their standard. So when it comes to AB 2011, and if someone were to do a 100% affordable housing project in a commercial zone, all of the units would have to be low-income households. The density would be no less than 30 dwelling units to the acre. And then typical of any project that is set aside for low income, you do have it deed restricted for 55 years. And in this case, it would be for those properties that are doing rental. And if anything is owner occupied, the deed restriction is for 45 years. When it comes to a mixed income housing project, not only is it located in a commercial zone, but it also has to abut a commercial corridor. And the law does have a definition of what a commercial corridor is, and it's basically the public right-of-way of the roadway, and it's anywhere between 70 feet and no greater than 150 feet. And that is applicable to a lot of our commercial properties on 6th Street, Ontario, Foothill. A lot of our centers are along these major arterial roads. And also the property frontage for any site needs to be at least 50 feet or more. And again, the acre is no greater than 20. If you do rental housing within a mixed income project, they do have a breakdown there. 8% of the units need to be low income and 5% of the units need to be extremely low. Or someone can do 15% of the total units for low income and it's deed restricted for 55 years. If an owner-occupied project is proposed, then 30% of the units need to be for moderate income or 15% needs to be dedicated for low income, and that restriction is also for 45 years. And they're also looking that the makeup of the units be the same as a market rate unit. So they do not want the affordable housing units to be any less than what a market rate unit would be in terms of the number of bedrooms and the size. As I indicated to you, AB 2011 does have some of its own objective development standards, but this is only applicable to mixed income. It's not applicable to the 100% residential use project. And when it comes to density, it's really a graduated scale. The larger the project, the higher the density. And as you can see on this table, if it's less than 1 acre, it falls within that 30 dwelling units to the acre. As the site gets bigger and the width gets bigger, it can go to 40 dwelling units to the acre and to 60. However, in any case, if you have a site that's within a half mile of a major transit stop, which we know is to be the Metrolink and our bus depot transfer station, it can go up to 80 dwelling units to the acre. And the same applies to the building height. It can be anywhere from 35 to 65 feet. It also describes some minimum building setbacks to the property. I don't want to go into detail on all of these, but the gist of it is basically it can have a zero setback to the property line. And in some cases, the setback may need to be a minimum of 10 or 15 feet given the circumstance. But the worst case scenario is that it would be 0. And then in one particular case, if you have a portion of a site that fronts a commercial corridor, the parking in that instance would need to be set back 25 feet. I do want to talk about the parking requirements. I could tell you this is not good news. There was legislation that went into effect January 1st of this year. Senate Bill 6 and AB 2011, when it comes to the 100% affordable housing project, the city can still apply its parking regulations, which is good news. However, projects do adhere to Assembly Bill 2097. We would have to apply that as well. And there is a definition in the law of what that is. And basically that bill states that a city the city cannot require its minimum parking requirement. And if it's within a half mile of a major transit stop. So we would have to go in and define where that major back. There we go. As we know, Metrolink and the bus depot transfer station is a major transit stop, but anything where there is a bus stop along 6th Street, we would have to make sure that it meets the criteria of the service intervals that are defined by the law. Unfortunately, under AB 2011, when it comes to the mixed income housing project, the bill outright says that no parking is required. So someone can technically come in, exercise this option, and they would not be subject to any of the city's parking requirements. That's exactly what this bill did. So that is disappointing in itself. However, we're hopeful that if anybody tries to do that, knowing market-wise that parking is going to be required in some fashion.
Ms. Clyde, before you pass on that last, can you, under the AB 2097, didn't the service interval used to be, they wanted it to be 10 minutes or less, and then we were at 15 minutes, like the current route 1A or whatever it is, the RTA route is every 15 minutes?
That is the current requirement now under this law, is that it says the service interval of 15 minutes or less during the morning and PM peak commuter times.
Okay, and I thought I remember when a version of this bill came the last time, it said 10 minutes, and that was one of the caveats where people said, okay, well, we don't have a 10-minute bus because that's not what RTA does, and it's okay. But in fact, I think I said it 2 years ago, they're going to push this up to 15 minutes because that's the average,
What are our bus route intervals?
15 minutes.
So can we change them to 16 minutes?
We don't control the buses.
Jim?
This table was provided to you just to show you what some of the comparison between the two bills are. Really, where there are no similarities, it's the affordable housing requirement. As I indicated, Senate Bill 6 does not require any affordable housing. And if you remember that ask, that is really what staff is trying to do, is get an affordable housing component with anything related to SB 6. Objective development standards are really not applicable in this bill to Senate Bill 6 other than the city's requirement. There are no additional standards. Parking restrictions are pursuant to the city's requirements are 2097, except for that mixed income housing. And the streamline review is only applicable to projects that have that affordable housing component. Other than that, a lot of the other things in the bill are very similar. And there is one thing about this bill you need to know is that it does require the workers constructing these projects to be part of prevailing wage. So that in itself may be a little discouraging, but that is a requirement for both of these projects. So again, the ask was to allow staff to apply that affordable housing overlay zone requirement when it comes to addressing Senate Bill 6. And I say that because I'm going to go through the pros and cons really quickly with you. SB 6 does not prevent the city from doing inclusionary housing. So allowing us to apply that affordable housing overlay zone would really be an inclusionary housing component, and it would allow us to at least capture some low-income units with these projects, which in my opinion is the whole premise of what we are trying to do with our housing element. As you recall, we were in here trying to find sites for those low-income housing units, and by not doing this, we jeopardize our other properties along 6th Street, which we have already identified as part of our housing sites inventory. We want to basically preserve those sites and make them available and not have to look elsewhere to try to replace those sites if they are not developed accordingly based on the program we have already put in place. Additionally, it will also establish some equality with some of the property owners. If we have already identified a property on 6th Street with the affordable housing overlay zone, but someone right next to them didn't get that, and then they exercise SB 6 and they get to do all market rate where the guy next door was subject to some affordable housing component, we want to make sure there's an equality there. And we also, again, don't want someone with the affordable housing overlay zone to exercise SB 6, and then I'm having to go back and find another site to replace that shortfall. If that is the direction by the council today, we would immediately start that process. We would do an amendment before the Planning Commission in May, and then we would come to the City Council in June with that ordinance change and then get it to go into effect by July 1, which is when these bills go into effect. So with that, I will leave it up to the City Council for questions or comments.
Thank you, Ms. Coletta, for being the bearer of bad news. Do my colleagues have any questions or comments? Go ahead.
Yes. Thank you for the overview. Both of these, when they were going through the system, yeah, we vehemently opposed both. I guess this is going to happen because there is, I mean, at some point, there will be somebody that comes forward. I do like the idea of inclusionary zoning, inclusionary housing, because it's proven it works. Making things 100%, affordable or 100% this or that, it doesn't help us in any way, shape, or form. So, I think this is a great compromise and allows some equal measure and equal amounts of control. I still, 2097 is with no parking is just deadly because it's this imagination that the state has imagined that all of these properties exist on an island and that cars just magically disappear when they get around that area. So, yeah, I think this is just the best case scenario of a bad set of choices. So I'm in favor of staff's recommendation.
Thank you, Ms. Coletta. I always appreciate the thorough and thoughtful analysis because this is really complicated. It's really, truly complicated. And I am also in favor of the recommendation. I think, though, that I really appreciate visuals, and I know that when it comes back to us, we'll be able to see like the actual map of where this is going to apply. And I would like to see that comparison, that like hypothetical that you mentioned that could happen where you have one property that without this, right? So that we can actually see what this overlay, how it creates that equity between parcels. So when that comes before us, I look forward to seeing that. I really think that all of these bills, as restrictive as they sound, I do wonder how much it will ultimately impact Corona. We don't have a lot of vacant property. We don't have huge skyscrapers. It seems like it's also really expensive to convert commercial buildings to residential buildings, even if, the standards, we can't apply standards. So I'm curious if there's any way for us to know, since these laws have been enacted, are we seeing them being used in other cities? Do we know how much they've been used in other cities? Genuinely out of curiosity, because I feel like it's a little bit like the ADA fear that we are seeing them happening, but there was a lot of fear when the laws first went through that it was that every home was going to suddenly have an ADA, but it's really ADU, sorry, ADU, because ADA is, yes, a law for disability. Sorry, nothing against ADA. ADUs, they're very expensive, so they're not happening as much as it was originally thought that they would. So I'm just trying to, as a policymaker, just kind of get my bearings on the real impact that we're seeing from this legislation. So if there's any way that you can provide that when it comes back to us, that would be really helpful for me. Thank you.
My turn. I was talking to Joanne a little bit last week, and she said that solar and ADU permits are skyrocketing in our city. So ADUs are by far up and away being built. And I don't necessarily think ADUs are a bad thing. It's when they say you get an ADU and a junior ADU, and then the doghouse gets an ADU. That's just recklessness. I see where Wes and Jackie's opinions are, and I see where Joanne's presentation is coming from. This is just adjusting to dysfunctional leadership in the city of Sacramento. We have leaders that don't understand that once you build obnoxiousness, those buildings stand for 50 to 100 years. They are going out of their way to make our city worse than better. So I'll go along with the presentation that Joanne gave just because that's the best path forward, but it's a horrible path forward. Thanks.
Ms. Coletta, I was kind of curious. Ms. Casillas was asking to see if there was any information about how this is impacting cities, and I kind of wonder if it would be more meaningful if it was cities like Corona. I mean, there are some cities where, you know, high density is very prevalent, and this isn't one of those cities. So I'm kind of wondering if there was a way to look for cities that are comparable and seeing what the effect would be, if that's possible. Was that?
I was just going to say that the biggest impediment to this is that the reason why you don't see it everywhere is it doesn't pencil out.
Yeah,
There
no,
isn't.
I agree.
That
I
doesn't
agree.
financial, unless the state wants to participate or is going to force cities, which I think is coming, force cities to help fund. I think it's setting things up. I always say everything's a step, right? So this is just one more step, and I'm curious about what the next step will be. And the next step will be funding, because this doesn't pay for itself. So
Can I ask one question? Can the city impose underground parking?
That would be a part of a objective development standard. I don't see why it couldn't, but it would have to be an objective development standard that the city has adopted.
What does that mean?
It means that we have an ordinance that requires that a percentage of the parking be placed underground or something like that.
And
So
that it
do-
applies uniformly, you know, that you're not just picking on the SB 6 or the AB 2011 projects. You're basically saying all projects in the commercial zone or similarly situated projects would have to have the underground parking.
So can we explore that as a hindrance going forward?
But it would also, so it would impact everything in a commercial zone. So think about, you know, what that would do to a business.
Well, the state doesn't think about what they're doing to
No,
business.
but we do. So that's the difference.
I would like to know a little bit about underground parking and how it can be used.
Ms. Coletta, do you have the direction that you're looking for? I think, oh, I'm sorry, that's correct. Ms. Edwards, are there any speaker cards from the public?
Mayor, yes, we have one speaker for this item.
Come on down, speaker. Wow, welcome.
I was at home, so I ran here because I really wanted to talk on this particular topic. I keep hearing the same language over and over and over again. And I live right in, Tom knows where I live, Tony, you know where I live. I'm on 9th Street, I'm not that far from 6th Street. And I always hear it cavalierly, oh, I'll have to work somewhere else to find some property for us that's low income because I can't shuffle everything onto 6th Street and into downtown. Oh, it would be a burden on businesses, poor businesses that have lots and lots of money if we require the parking to be underground. The focus is in the wrong place for District 3. And you need to remember that people live there and we live near 6th Street, and this is going to directly impact us. I'm not going to cuss, but do I give an F if it's a little bit harder for a developer to build because he has to put in underground parking? They do it in Burbank, they do it everywhere else. They do it for developments, they do it for everything. There are people that live down here. Staff needs to take that into consideration. It's not just a free-for-all for business. There are other places that we can put properties. There are other places that we can put developments. They don't all have to be on 6th Street and they don't all have to be down in District 3. I don't feel like the people that actually live there are being taken into account. And every time Mr. Richens brings something up, everybody goes, oh, well, or, oh, we'll look into that. It's never, oh my gosh, yeah, there are people that live down there. I'm one of the people that live down there. All of my neighbors live down there. There are a lot of really good people down there, and we're not all poor. We're restoring historic homes. We're doing big things down there. We're trying to make that a better neighborhood for everyone. And I really get tired of hearing the same thing over. Oh, well, we need to think of the businesses. I really hope you guys will keep reminding staff and the city manager and planning that there are people that live down there and they don't want this to just be where we're carrying the burden for the whole city, for low-income housing, for developers that want to develop on 6th Street. I'm so sick of hearing about this every single time. And Tom, God bless you because you bring something up every time, but you're way too nice. And they walk right over you every time. I live down there, and I'm not a business, and I need you to advocate for me, not always for them. Please. Thank you.
Thank you.
Joe Morgan, 2063 Ren. I grew up on the north side. I'd like to broaden the discussion out to the north side, the entire north side. I've said it a million times in here that basically everything from 6th Street north is destined to be an apartment ashtray. You know, it's like, well, you know, that's the place to put it. We put all this stuff and we act like it's predestined. Well, you mentioned everything's a step, you know, and this is another step, and everything at every single meeting is another step. And I agree with Mr. McCoy that the residents that are down there are not being taken into account. I don't think that anybody thinks about how, you know, throwing all the housing down there is going to change fundamentally what downtown is. You know, it's like I'm just so tired of this, you know, well, more density is going to make it more successful, you know, like that we got to put the housing down. That's Talbert's line. That's his nonsense he used to spout. You just throw up enough houses and then something magical is going to happen. Something will happen. I don't know what it is, but something's going to happen. I don't have a plan for it, but I'm sure something's going to happen. You know, because it's the old council's line. Well, we can't do anything cool downtown because there's just not enough people down there. Because that's where all the pores are. You know, and functionally, I'm not sure that anything's really changed in that manner. You know, you have the Disney guys talking about making Main Street one lane. But besides that, I don't really know that much has changed about the attitude, and particularly about downtown. I mean, it's not valued as being a downtown. It's not valued as being a residential area. You know, I hope the second item is going to address that somewhat. You know, I really do. We need to value it as really the historical heart of the city, and you know, we want people to want to live there, and we don't want to crowd everybody out, but just, you know, high density after high density after high density from City Park all the way to Maple. You know, it's kind of what we're setting ourselves up for, and I think people are going to wake up and go, what the hell happened here? What the hell happened? Meanwhile, Kellogg and Magnolia is wide open. 5 acres sitting there. Well, we're not doing anything about that. There's no, you know, I mean, you could put something right there. No, it wouldn't hurt anything. Nobody would care. I live right there. Wouldn't change anybody's world, but, you know, we can just throw more crap on 6th Street and, you know, it doesn't matter. Thank you.
Mayor, if I may, I want to clarify something really quickly. When it comes to Senate Bill 6 and AB 2011, it's just not isolated to 6th Street. We will be amending numerous specific plans because we have commercial properties located throughout the city. Northeast Corona, South Corona. So this will affect properties on Ontario. It's going to affect properties on Green River. It will affect properties on McKinley Street. So we are basically blanketing the entire city to have the affordable housing overlay caveat should somebody try to exercise it. So I do want to make that clear. It wasn't specifically targeted for 6. Yes, you have some commercial property along there, but we have commercial properties in other areas of town that we want to make sure that we blanket. So yes, the whole intention of this is to make everybody pull their weight and provide affordable housing. That is the only way to do it.
Mr. Mayor, thank you. Ms. Coletta, thank you so much for clarifying that. I think there is a genuine misunderstanding and some misplaced anger. I also want to just remind everyone that not only does this council care deeply about the downtown, that we've actually taken policy measures and are investing heavily in the downtown. There's the 6th Street beautification, there's a city park master plan, there's a downtown revitalization. I mean, I don't know how many more ways this council can show that our heart is with the downtown and that our intention is to reinvest and bring up the downtown. So it's hard not to get emotional. I was born and raised in the downtown. I very much love the downtown. So I don't want there to be a misunderstanding about this council's direction and intention, because I think our actions have shown exactly how much we care and love for the downtown. It's not lost on any of us. And again, we are here talking about policies that are passed by Sacramento. This is not a policy that your council has decided to arbitrarily impose on our residents. We have to be super clear about why it is that we're here and what it is that we're talking about. So if I come across as angry, it's because I slightly am. But I want the record to be very, very clear that it is not your council that is imposing this, and your council is absolutely not imposing it just on 6th Street and just on downtown residents. It is a state law that is being imposed on literally everybody. Thank you, Mayor.
Okay, Ms. Coletta, I think you have the direction. Thank you. All right, item number 2, request from Councilmember Speak to explore possible revisions to the city's historic resource ordinance, Corona Municipal Code, Chapter 17.63. Jay Eastman, Planning Manager, will present this item.
Thank you, Mayor and members of the City Council. My name is Jay Eastman. I am the city's planning manager for the Planning Division. As requested by Councilmember Speak, today we are discussing the city's historic resources ordinance and asking for feedback on possible changes to the ordinance. To provide some background, the City Council held a study session last November to consider forming an ad hoc committee and to evaluate changes to the ordinance. The City Council chose not to form a committee at that time and directed staff to study the issue and bring it back to Council for discussion at a future study session, and today is that future study session. Regarding the city's historic resources ordinance, it was adopted in 2001. It establishes criteria for approving properties or a structure as a local landmark and placing it on the Corona Registry of Historic Places or Resources. It establishes criteria for listing of a geographical area as a historic district, and it establishes criteria for alterations, relocation, or demolition of historic resources. As a result of the 2001 ordinance, the city now has 529 properties listed within an historic inventory. The historic inventory is a collection of properties that contribute to or have the potential to contribute to the city's history. The inventory identifies each property's location, type of structure, year built, and potential for landmark listing, whether that be that it has a high potential, moderate, or low potential. Heritage properties exhibit attributes worthy of consideration for landmark listing. And as a result of that heritage inventory, we now have 62 properties listed as local landmarks within the city, and we have 10 historic districts. Of those 62 properties, 4 are listed on the National Registry of Historic Places, and we do have one street, Grand Boulevard, which is also a local historic district, and that one street is listed also on the National Registry of Historic Places. The city has also entered into 45 agreements under the Mills Act. The Mills Act is a program where property owners get tax benefits, tax reductions for improvements to their property. And the city does maintain and implement design guidelines for preserving historic buildings. So for today, the 5 areas of discussion that I'll present will be some of the current challenges, just to kind of identify some of the things we deal with. We will be asking for input from, or we will share with you some input we received from the Corona Historic Preservation Society. We will be discussing possible amendments to the Historic Preservation Ordinance, and we'll explore the creation of an additional pathway for getting homes recognized and qualified for property preservation agreements under the Mills Act. And finally, we will explore potential changes to the property preservation agreements. And just to clarify as I move forward, after the November meeting, city staff did look into historic preservation resource ordinances for 5 other cities, just to kind of give us a framework for considering changes. And just for your benefit, those cities were Riverside, Redlands, the city of Orange, city of Fullerton, the city of Claremont, and those would be the 5. So Redlands, Riverside, Orange, Fullerton, and Claremont. So to discuss briefly some of our current challenges, number 1, the city has 3 separate design guidelines for residential properties. Those include the design guidelines for historic buildings. Those are guidelines specifically for buildings that are listed in a historic inventory. We also have a citywide residential development design guideline, and in those guidelines, it does say that it is applicable to additions to historic buildings. And then within the downtown revitalization specific plan, we do have design guidelines that are applicable to properties. It's not bad that we have guidelines. The issue is that we have 3 different documents. The public has to review those documents. In some cases, those guidelines overlap each other. Oftentimes, they're consistent, but there could be some interpretation. So it does become a little bit challenging and overwhelming for the public to know what to apply and when. Additionally, number 2, downtown is not officially adopted as a historic district. We often refer to downtown as being historic, the historic downtown, but technically speaking, only Grand Boulevard is a historic district or identified as a historic district. And we do have individual buildings within the circle and outside the circle that are individually historic or identified as historic, but we don't actually list it as a historic district. We do have criteria that applies to the downtown that acts to preserve buildings, but the challenge we have is this, is that oftentimes somebody with a property that is either it's a vacant property or it has a relatively new development on it, new house that's from, say, 1970, 1980, they will go out, get an architect, prepare plans to redesign that old building or build a new structure. And when it comes to us, they already have a vision in place, and they will tell us, but my property is not in a historic district. It's, why are you applying these, what they feel are onerous or overbearing requirements? Because they didn't know, for whatever reason, that their property isn't, that those criteria are applicable. And so we end up with this situation where we try to fix something that was already pre-designed when it came to us. Additionally, the city does not have any architectural style standards for new residential within Grand Avenue or on the outskirts of Grand Avenue. So if somebody wants to design a building on a vacant lot and use the farmhouse architectural style that we're now seeing in some commercial developments or residential developments, we will point them to the design criteria, but there's nothing that actually says the style that they need to build the house in. And so we often are in this debate as to what's appropriate and what should be done. Number 4, our historic preservation regulations are not well promoted. And by that, I mean, they're not all necessarily consolidated in a single web page. We don't have flyers that give good direction on implementation, things of that nature. And so in that context, either a property owner would have to go find the documents or they need to speak with us to get direction. And so that is a challenge we're currently faced with. Our historic preservation regulations can be perceived as verbose, interpretive in some cases, and soft. And by soft, I mean it uses the terminology of should do this rather than shall do this. Although the guidelines are clear that should is a mandatory term, it's often perceived as being arbitrary. And then just generally, I think we can all recognize that historic preservation done right can be more costly. It's, you're replacing windows on a building, it can cost more, and that is a challenge that we deal with residents. Moving on, I wanted to touch on the Historic Preservation Society's input. We did meet with them a while back. They did provide us with changes to the Historic Preservation Ordinance that they would like to see. While their changes are more than just these 2 items, most of that is more technical, if you will. Really, the 2 big changes is that they would recommend that we establish a historic commission or committee, and that be a 5-member body with expertise in either architecture, historic preservation, design, something of that nature, and some education and background in historic preservation, and that those members be appointed by council. They would study the city's historic inventory, they would evaluate historic applications, they make a recommendation to the city council on historic and cultural matters, and generally maintain the Corona Registry of Historic Resources. The number 2 item is that they are suggesting that we would establish 2 new resource types. Those would be designated historic resources and then also structures of merit, which are properties that don't qualify for landmark properties, but they have some merit for consideration for listing. So these next 2 slides are to discuss potential changes to the Historic Preservation Ordinance itself. One of those is to consider an update that would clarify definitive residential architectural styles, specifically for infill development and major renovations of non-contributing buildings. Currently, these are essentially the 6 architectural styles that are established in our historic preservation design guidelines, the design guidelines for historic buildings. But if you have a vacant lot, you don't have a historic building, what do we apply to that? And so these are the 6 styles we list. Number 2, possible amendments would also consider the creation of a preservation area or a preservation zone. This would be a lesser category than a landmark district. This would be similar to what the Historic Society is proposing as structures of merit, but this would be more on a neighborhood scale. And so these would be areas that you would apply criteria and regulations to, but it wouldn't necessarily be as onerous, if you will, as a landmark district. Number 3 would be to establish a Corona Historic Commission or committee. And this was recommended by the Historic Society. They would review major alterations to historic buildings and districts instead of the Planning Commission, because essentially currently the Planning Commission serves as the Historic Commission. They would review architectural styles for residential infill against adopted architectural standards. And just to be clear, when we talk about infill, we're not referring to ADUs, because ADUs are ministerial by law. So those are things that we have to approve over the counter. Doesn't mean that we can't apply architectural standards, but it just wouldn't go to the commission for consideration. And then they would act as an architectural review board, generally speaking. And so they would have the knowledge and ability to apply architectural standards. And then there has been some discussion about the 50-year rule, and I want to clarify this briefly. There was some discussion about removing the 50-year rule. we believe that we should keep the 50-year rule, but really look at rather establishing some historic era context. And the reason is this, is that the 50-year rule, one, is integral to how historic preservation is done, both on the national and the state level. The National Park Service established the 50-year rule, I believe, in 1948. And the 50-year rule is this. It says that a building cannot be considered historic unless it's 50 years old or has unique circumstances, which the federal government has historically applied to us. For instance, things that are presidential in relation, related to presidential issues or atomic issues, things like that. So the rule is it can't be historic unless it's 50 years old. Often people think the 50-year rule is if it's 50 years, it's historic, which is the exact opposite of what it's intended to do. So we think it would make more sense to establish an historic era context for neighborhoods than eliminate the 50-year rule. The last two items are these. One is explore the creation of an additional pathway for getting homes recognized and qualified for property preservation agreements under the Mills Act. Currently, the city requires that if you want to enter into the Mills Act contract, you would have to be a landmark building. The question is do we want to allow for a lesser building than a landmark building to be able to implement tax savings for enhancements to the building? In our research, we generally found that it's not a common practice in cities to allow for non-landmark buildings unless they're in a historic district. Or if they do allow for non-landmark buildings, there's a lot of scrutiny that goes into the review of those buildings and the enhancements that would be done. The other issue about that is that the formula for your tax benefit is established by the county and the tax assessor, and it applies evenly. So you would essentially, it is somewhat a question of equity. So you would essentially be providing the same tax incentives for somebody doing work to a non-landmark building versus one that is a landmark building. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's something to consider. I think one way to address that is if you have a non-landmark building and you're getting a Mills Act contract, the contributions or the improvements that you're making to the building would have to be significant enough that it creates either a landmark building through the enhancements, it brings it up to snuff, if you will, or it makes some relative impact on a historic district or the neighborhood. And those are details that could be worked out should the council wish to move forward with that context. And finally, there's the question of should we make changes to our preservation agreement. Currently, the way that we operate is pretty basic. Somebody wants to enter into an agreement with the city for tax benefits, they would submit to us what the changes or what the improvements are that they would make to their house. We bring that to the city council, and then they would make a decision as to whether to adopt it. And then that's in place. And so they move forward with a tax benefit for a 10-year period. The Mills Act is set up so that it renews automatically every year, so it continues on in perpetuity. We don't really have any additional criteria to go back and say, you need to make more improvements or do more maintenance on your building. So an example of a more stringent type of criteria is one that the city of Fullerton adopted recently, a couple years ago. And in that, in a nutshell, they require that the property owner submit a progress report to the city every year to show the work that they've done. And then at the 5-year point, there's a progress inspection that's conducted. And just before the end of the first 10 years, the property owner needs to submit a rehabilitation and maintenance plan to the city if they want to continue in the Mills Act program. If the property owner chooses not to continue, then essentially the Mills Act is ended. It's not terminated, but the contract ends and they have 10 years left on their sales tax incentives. So that's a consideration as to whether we want to beef up our preservation agreements or keep them very basic as they are today. So these are the items we're asking that you consider today. Expand the type of designated resources. We've identified 3 in this presentation. Establish a historic commission establish architectural styles for infill non-historic structures, change eligibility criteria for preservation agreements, and expand preservation agreement program requirements. The next steps after your conversation will be to organize today's feedback into draft revisions, prepare guidelines for new construction that include architectural styles, and then return to the City Council at a future study session. And now, after I've spoken way too much, it's an opportunity for you guys to have a conversation.
Thank you, Mr. Eastman. This definitely is a lot going on in here, and I think that's probably best to just take them one at a time, because I feel like there's gonna be lots of conversation, and I don't think that we're gonna come to a consensus on all 5 of them. So I would suggest that we do them one at a time, and we could start, unless anybody has any objections, but we could start with item A. And, but before we do that, why don't we go to speaker cards from the public and then go from there? Ms. Edwards, do we have any speaker cards from the public?
Mayor, yes, we have 2 speaker cards.
Wes, thank you very much for getting the ball rolling on this. It's very much appreciated. This is so needed, and I really appreciate all the work that's been put into this. I love what staff has come up with as a proposal. I would adopt everything. I think everything that they just laid out is perfect. I really love the idea of putting a time limit on these, because you don't need a tax break forever if you're fixing up your house, unless you're doing maintenance. If there's a high level of maintenance and you can show what maintenance needs to be done every year, absolutely. But it's not just free money, and I think a lot of homeowners view it as, oh, well, I just get on Mills Act because I have a historic home and I get this free money and I don't have to do anything. They need to be accountable. It's about preservation. So I really appreciate that that's going to be put in there. I love the idea of having the committee do that. I know that that's not a super popular idea, but I think it's putting the onus on the Planning Commission to also have vast knowledge of historic preservation and understanding what these buildings mean. I think that's probably asking a little too much of them when their plate's full. So I think having, what level of impact that has, that I'm sure that's something you can all debate, but I really love the idea of having a separate committee that's just working on that. And finally, I would very much like to see us expand that district as far as we can, so we have some enforcement available. As we all know, we just had that property go in on Victoria, right next to a bunch of Victorian homes. That is just this modern architectural nightmare, and there's no way that we can do anything about it because, oops, well, it's not really a historic district that we can enforce. So having some teeth in our overall policy I think is great. And just real quick from before, I know you all live downtown. I'm not trying to say you don't. I often feel like we worry too much about the businesses down there and not about the historic properties down there and the homes and the residents. So anyway, that's it. I support this completely. I hope you'll adopt it as is. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening. I'd like to also second, I don't think for a second that you don't care about downtown. I'm talking to you directly. I don't think that's the case at all. I see functionally, I see you doing things as a council because that's how they're presented to you. And this should have come up, Mr. McCoy, we've been talking about this for a long time. I know Wes has been talking about this for a long time. the fact that we don't have a historic district in the downtown that encompasses, off the top of my head as a lifer here, at least from Lincoln to Ford Street, that our historic district doesn't cover that area. You go to every other city that you look at the entire downtown Riverside from Market to the west is a historic district. Is every house in there historic? No. But everybody knows where it is. We think it's here, but functionally, when it comes to some of the state legislation, we've untied our hands because we haven't taken it seriously down there. We haven't acted like this is important to us. You say what's important to you, and then you have more options to defend it. So, yeah, you should do all these things. We should have had a historic commission a long time ago. It's not fair to have the planning commission have to get into all these things. They've done an admirable job. I've seen them go to the mat for some of these things. But it's not like they live and breathe these items. It's not like this is, the details of all these houses are as important as they are to Tom and to Wes and our budding historian Jim. So you should have it. You should have some experts doing it. So yeah, I say yes to all 5 of them. Make it as expansive as possible, and make it as difficult as possible to build things down there that don't fit. Value this area and call it what it is. This is our historic downtown area, and fight for it. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so just in the interest of time, I want to make sure that this gets the proper consideration that it does. So we do have a drop dead time, and we'll take these items one at a time, and then we'll, if we get up to that drop dead time, then we'll just ask for an extension and a second study session to complete this. Fair enough?
Yep.
Good. Okay, so we'll just start with item A.
Mayor, sorry to interrupt you. I have 2 additional speaker
Oh,
cards.
I'm sorry. I thought there was only 2 cards.
Karen Alexander, Planning Commissioner. I'm glad it's being brought forward today. On the commission, we have had some challenges before us on different agenda items. And identifying a downtown historic district, I think, is important for that preservation. We also need to have a discussion on home ownership. How do we know we didn't know we live in a historic district. We didn't know that certain rules apply to it. I love the idea of opening it up for a tiered system where there are applying for Mills Act, and there's those that meet its requirements versus those that exceed requirements and get that recognition. As far as the compliance within the Mills Act, I think it's great that it's on the owners to submit plans and then follow up to make sure that there's truth in that plan and the reality is at their home. And I think having a commission dealing with historic is a great idea. Thank you.
Thank you. One more?
Members of the City Council, Richard Wynn speaking on behalf of the Historic Preservation Society. I would like to correct a couple of things on Mr. Eastman's slide. One is on National Register historic properties that are listed on the National Register. For some reason or other, there is a difference at the state and the federal level for buildings that are eligible. We have only one eligible building in Corona. It's the Corona Theater. All it needs is for the owner to say, I no longer object to its listing. Another item is we do have the Grand Boulevard Historic District, where the Heritage Park is in the process of submitting an application to create a second National Register recognized district in Corona out of there. I was very happy to see Commissioner Alexander stand up here, because one of the things that got us involved in this was previous councils had given us direction that we should seek to make sure that only the best cream of the crop, top drawer properties are worthy of landmark status. And we had a little run-in with the Planning Commission on our recommendation to not put a property on there a couple of 3 years ago. Because yes, it was old, as Mr. Eastman said, it was more than 50 years old, but it really didn't meet the landmark definition. It could have been a structure of merit, could have been a historic resource, but it really wasn't a landmark in the terms that we were given to evaluate by the city council. So that's what brought a lot of this to the forefront. But our organization is very supportive of the effort that the city has put into this staff report. It's better than anything that it's better than what we originally submitted for sure. And we would like to work with them in the same way we've been working with the Planning Commission for the last 20 years. And if it's a question of who has staff time to type out all this crap, excuse me. I have pretty much been maintaining as a volunteer to the planning department the historic register since 2017, because they just didn't have somebody that they could give the time to do it. And for me, I caught it up in less than a week, and it takes half a day to update it every year if we have something new on the list. So I don't have any problem with doing that. And in fact, if there's a problem with somebody finding time to put together whatever the staff report is, I'd be happy to help out who has other duties doing that. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you. Okay. So we're going to start with item A, which will be the expanding the types of designated resource. Do my colleagues have any comments?
Sure. Since this is my item, I thanks for the opportunity to speak a little bit. I really see this, and I've been patiently waiting for 2 years to get to this point where we could talk about it. So I'm very happy to be in this position. I think that the time was well spent. Staff did a great job, captured even the little things that I really wanted to come across. So I'm more than happy to go through each one of these and explain kind of where I'm coming from for each one of these things. But the overarching overarching item is we need to invest in what's important to us as a community. And I see this as an investment. Each one of these things are designed to preserve and support our current residents, the folks that live there, the folks that will live there, and for future residents, ones that are going to come, years and years from now. So I see each one of these as a way to do that. So starting with A, I think having different designated historic resources, I think, is a great idea. The structure of merit and having different criteria, the idea behind that was, as Mr. Wynn said, giving money to things that are already done is kind of like only giving money to people who already have it. If you have a structure that is owned by a family that, and I'll give you the perfect example, right on 3rd Street, there's a house in between Merrill and I forget the next street. And it's beautiful, 1930s house. Families owned it probably for 20 years, and they were pulling their windows out. And I ran over and said hi, introduced myself, brought my then girlfriend with me to interpret and in Spanish, and was able to talk to them about what they were doing with the house, how that there was opportunities for folks to help. They were really excited about that. But they said, no, we love the windows too. We want to do this. Provided them with opportunities for a grant opportunity and talked to them about applying for Mills Act protection. And however, that house, it's not the best of the best because it needs help to get there. And we don't have a criteria for that. So if we had a structure of merit, because it's a very unusual house, there isn't another one like it in the city, that it would be the perfect opportunity for someone to see a discount on their on their property tax and be able to invest it back in their house without having to have to come out or have to substitute cheaper, non-conforming, not original pieces to the house. It helps them. So I really see this as a way to both two things. One, protect what we have now and find additional ways to help people. The preservation zones, I think that's a no-brainer. I mean, we need to have that. I mean, that's from a state level. SB 9 says that you can't do anything in an historic district. I had no idea that we didn't have an historic district. So that means SB 9 could have done anything it wanted, and thank God it hasn't been, taken up by a lot of people. But our entire downtown is right now vulnerable for that bill because, and frankly, I think people don't know that. So getting that is really important. So I think that A is really a no-brainer. I think literally everything on this list is a no-brainer to talk about. B, I think there's just some discussions,
Wes.
but I'm starting with A.
No, can we go piece by piece? Because we are going to run out of time, and you're giving us context.
I just stopped. I'm stopping with A. That's all I'm saying. I'm saying if there's anybody has any heartburn with any of the other ones, it's fine. We can stop with each
I
one.
have heartburn.
Okay, fine. All
Okay.
good. A. I'm a thumbs up with A.
Jim?
Okay, so if I understand A, it's basically like baby steps getting you to the Mills Act. It incentivizes the ultimate goal if someone is able to get to the ultimate goal, which I'm really in favor of, because sometimes, the example you just gave, I think is perfect, because I'm in favor of us pursuing policies that essentially help preserve, but I want to be absolutely certain that we are not hindering any homeowner that A, doesn't want to pursue it, or B, doesn't have the resources to do so. And this seems to just kind of, if I'm understanding it all correctly, it just kind of gives a couple of steps in between and says hey, you won't get the whole thing, but you'll get some of it, and it goes along the way.
It's voluntary.
But this expanding the designated resources, are we also under consideration of limiting the Mills Act in perpetuity? Because that's something, I'm not a historic home owner, but that is an incentive.
I think that's more D.
That's D. Okay, then I'm going to stop right there. Then I'm in favor of A as well. Thank you.
I don't think you need me to expand on it. I'll just say I'm in favor of A.
Okay. Well, I think that there's the required amount of votes here to go ahead with A. I think that we need to do some identification of these zones and the structures with merit. So I'm interested to see what you guys come up with that.
Can I just ask a clarifying question? So we vote yes on A, right? So that means it's going to be brought back in more detail.
Yes,
Is that-
staff's gonna
I'm understanding that right?
Yeah, we will work with the Historic Preservation Society to craft the criteria and the processes and things like that, and we will bring that back for consideration.
Okay, just checking.
Okay, great. So item B, which is establish an historic commission or committee. And I'll start with you.
Okay. I really see the Historic Commission as a very limited, very narrow scoped group that would literally meet maybe twice a year, really focusing on properties that would be applicable to the Mills Act and would only be activated by this body. They would not be, you wouldn't have a committee that's out looking for things to do and make trouble for people. They would have a very defined scope, meet a couple times a year, and their responsibilities would be basically to, when you have part of D is this Mills Act part, that one of their scopes would be to go and make sure that people have done the things they said they would do. And when you're talking about stuff with the Mills Act, it's on the outside of the property, so you don't need to go in anybody's house. If someone says, I'm gonna replace my door, they would walk up and go, yep, they replaced their door, good, they're doing what they said, great. That their scope would be really, really limited. So they wouldn't get into this, subjective that this is good enough, this is not great enough. It's really focused on just a couple things. And the only other item I would say that would be included in that would be like Riverside, theirs is broader, they have a lot more houses, they have a lot more issues. They did tackle a cultural resource or cultural context document that was funded by an outside group, what I think was great, and I would love to see one done in Corona too. But that's really, I would like it to be very, very, very focused and not paid.
Well, I think you guys pretty much know that I'm not a big history buff. But that's okay, because we are surrounded by history buffs. We have 4 in this room alone. And I don't generally like to act like I know what I'm talking about when I don't. And I don't speak this language that we're talking about here today. So I think that all of these items could be vetted through some sort of historic commission or committee, and have those that are just really passionate about this stuff look at all these ideas and bring forward what they believe is the best approach. And I do believe that it would take a lot of pressure and a lot of workload off our staff and our planning commission, because Chris is right. These are just regular people on planning commission. They don't necessarily have any extra knowledge when it comes to historical items. So let's put the group of people together that are passionate about it, that are really knowledgeable about it, and let them pretty much tell us what they would like to see. So that's all.
And this is the one that I have heartburn over.
I know.
We're not experts on history. I am speaking for myself. I am not an expert on history. I'm also not an expert on water. I'm not an expert on infrastructure. I'm not an expert on development. I'm not an expert on parks, but I make votes on all those every time. And I don't believe in building government just to build government. And I had a different idea before I got elected. I thought that formalizing commissions and committees would help us get community engagement and work through issues in an efficient way. And what I have seen is actually more is not always more. Sometimes more is just more. So I like the idea of pursuing a way to address historic preservation through an informed process in its limited capacity, as Wes is suggesting. I dislike the idea of creating another formal body that dilutes the power of the commission on the planning and housing and dilutes the power of the council. A group of experts and local experts that can inform us and advise on a limited capacity, that can have a really tailored and narrow scope, is something I'd be willing to entertain. But I don't like the idea of a commission. I don't like the idea of another body. I don't like the idea of a formalized Brown Act meeting.
I think the idea is that just like all the other commissions, they don't make decisions, they make recommendations.
Except the Planning and Housing Commission, it does have authority. Did you get it?
No, they still make recommendations. We're
Right.
the final,
So
I don't see this any different.
But we defer often to our experts on those commissions and committees. And I'm willing and interested in getting experts to give us good thought. I don't want a formal body, and I don't want to dilute the powers that is, and I don't like more red tape. I just genuinely don't. I want an efficient, good government. So, this is the one where I'm going to say no, but I'm not opposed to exploring ways for us to pursue getting the perspective of historians, especially local historians, on input, especially to look into Mills Act properties. So those are my thoughts.
Thank you, Mayor. In 1886,
We got 20 minutes, Tom.
I'm going to use all of it. So Robert Taylor came to Corona with the vision, and the vision was a circle that he got from Omaha, Nebraska. And it was community and religion and schools and homes and the inside of the circle. And it was agriculture on the outside of the circle. It's probably one of the best examples of master planning that we've ever seen, and he did it in 1886. And obviously now those days have come and gone, and we have everything everywhere, and it's no longer confined to inside the circle. But because for so long it was confined into the circle, the majority of all of the historic buildings, or most of the historic buildings, are within the circle or on the outliers of the circle. You might find some ranch houses here and there, but it's mostly within the circle and outline. So the problem, and I don't want to slam the building department because it's just not the right thing to do here, but the problem is we have a very, very busy planning department. They are busy, and as a construction worker, I'm actually quite impressed with city planning departments that they can keep up with so many types of construction between commercial, industrial, residential, public works. There is a full gamut of things that they have to plan check. And hats off to them. And they catch a lot of hell. And when you sit down and write a priority list of everything that our building department is doing, checking for historic buildings is very, very low on their list. And so every 2 or 3 years, one squeaks by, such as Victoria, and then my blood pressure goes through the roof, and then the neighbors start writing me letters, and then I blow up again, and it's a vicious cycle, and it's been going on for a long time. If you have a historic commission in place, that's where that commission steps in, and these guys know our circle. They know Robert Taylor's name, and they know his vision. I was talking to Mike Downs about this a couple weeks ago, and he said, Tom, I so desperately want to volunteer for this historic commission. You talk to any of the neighbors and within the circle, they want a historic commission, because when you buy a historic house, you put a ton of money into it to keep it up and make it historic. And if you marry an architect, I promise you'll buy original light fixtures and go even more overboard. But it's, when you finish it, you walk in that house and you're walking back in time. And when you walk through a historic neighborhood, I dare you to go to Pasadena and check out the green and green houses that are scattered throughout. You are walking back in time, and this is what makes community thrives. The Mills Act was only put in place for one purpose and one purpose only, and that was to stimulate homeowners of historic homes to maintain historic homes. It had nothing to do with landmark nonsense. It had nothing to do with who owned the house before, even though you have to fill all that stuff out. It was to preserve old houses, period. So I'm hoping that we can have a historic commission. It's 3 to 5 members, probably an odd number, 3 to 5 members. These people are probably going to come from within the circle, I'm guessing, over time. And if some come from outside the circle, great. Let them learn the history. We need more people to learn our history. They will catch the things that's low on the building department's list will be high on their list. And then you're going to get informed knowledge. Probably the best thing you can do with the historic commission is you get informed consent, right? These are the people that lived through it. These are the people that bought a house. Here's an example for windows. Everybody says that wood windows are so expensive, so put in vinyl. Wood windows are cheaper than vinyl. You just got to know where to buy them. I bought 8 wood windows a year ago, and I put the price 2 years ago. I'll put the price of those windows up to any vinyl window, but people just don't know where to look. You have this body of people, a commission that knows the history, and then when you have an architect that brings forward plans and they've already put a ton of time into it to a historic commission, oftentimes, here's the problem. There's not that many architects out there, if any, that know how to design a historic house, because that's not where they make their money. They make their money in more modern housing or really commercial or wherever. So you're not going to have architects that have knowledge, or very few, and if you find them, They're probably working on the multi-million dollar projects. The Historic Commission will catch what that architect brings forward, and I promise you, every architect that's local around here will be caught, because they won't know how to build historic houses because they don't design historical houses. I think this group needs to meet in public. With the Planning Commission, I love our Planning Commission, and they're so wonderful. But there's times when there's just no reason for the Planning Commission to meet. And you see an email and it says, hey, no Planning Commission on Monday, we don't have anything for you. And the Planning Commissioners are like, yeah, great, and they're probably pretty happy with it. I think that's how our Historical Commission should work. If they're scheduled to meet, and if there's nothing for them to review, then don't meet, you know? But I think they need to catch the building, the infill projects, they need to catch the ADU projects, they need to catch the open area projects. And really what it does is it makes it so when you walk through our old town, they're the gatekeeper. They're protecting the feel that you look when you drive through our old town. And we desperately need those protections.
So that's three yeses, but I'm not counting.
So, so I'm not a fan of
think so.
historic commissions, and I actually do have experience with them, having lived in the city of Orange for a number of years and seeing the challenges that they presented by having, you know, a very similar type of commission. I'm not going to lie, in order for me to be even semi-happy with this, the scope has to be extremely narrow. And right here on the recommendations, it talks about 5 members with expertise or education. And that is actually one of the main scopes for me, because there are amateur historians and there are people that think that they know a little bit about history, but they don't have any experience with it. So for me, I don't think that a historic commission is needed. I think what I would be happier with is something that Tom touched on, is people that have a desire to renovate or restore an older home. The biggest challenge is they don't know where to turn for resources, right? So they don't understand, how can I rebuild this window rather than replace it, as an example. That's a big one. And so there needs to be some sort of resources provided that they could, you know, talk to contractors that understand historical preservation, et cetera. And just like this council, there's a couple historians on here. There's also some people that are not historians. And I would be willing to bet you that in our city, there are people that this isn't high on their priority list. I believe that the people that live in this circle, it's probably a little higher on their priority list, but there's also people in that circle that have generational homes that aren't, you know, wanting to preserve them in a historical fashion. And they may not have the resources, they may not have the energy, they may not have the wherewithal. And so this gets us into muddy waters as far as I'm concerned, by having some sort of commission that you know, could influence what happens to somebody that may or may not want it to be done. So I'm a no, but I would, if, you know, there's 3 people that said yes, so it's going to come back, and I would suggest that that scope needs to be very narrowly defined. We need to have conversation about what those members look like, as far as what type of expertise and education do they have where they could be beneficial, and provide good information in order for us to make a decision. So I'm a no, but when it comes back, that scope's got to be very, very narrow. And it's more of a resource committee rather than a commission that's going to dictate yes or no type of thing. So
Mr. Mayor, can I have 2 follow-up questions?
Please.
Because clearly it's a 3-2. But what I want to posit for my colleagues is a couple of concerns, and I don't know where it lies here, but What happens specifically, to the mayor's point, to those homeowners that have a historic home or are now designated a historic home who want to invest in their home but do not want to do so historically? Will they be penalized?
No.
Will there be fines? They'll be able to put a vinyl window instead of a wood window.
Yeah.
And then the other question be, thinking about its impacts, if there are to Vice Mayor Richens' points about there being very few architects that have historical knowledge, therefore, supply and demand, they're likely more expensive. So what happens, again, to a homeowner who wants to pursue making an ADU and does not want to have a historic-looking building? Are they fined? Are they?
No, so here's, I want to make sure you all know me. I'm always more the carrot guy than I am the stick guy. So this whole thing is designed to provide people resources to be able to do things, but not to punish people if they don't. I am a firm believer in private property rights. If you buy a house and you want to do something to it, other than tear it down. If you tear it down, that's a different thing. If you want to paint your door, polka dotted, it's your door. That's not what this would be about. That's why I was talking about a very limited scope. It's really just to provide people that would like to do this an opportunity and a path forward.
I think we're looking at the wrong scenario. So take the person that has an old house, right? And they don't have the money to develop it more. You can't make someone comply with historical standards going forward. They already own the house, right? But it's to their advantage if, like, let's say it's a multi-generational house and it's the third generation there and it's been passed down and passed down. It's to their advantage to invest and make it historical because, one, the demand for a historical house is through the roof. People want historical houses. People go out of their way. My neighbor's 99 years old. And people knock on her door and say, "I want to buy your house." And she can't even see anymore. And she yells, "Over my dead body." Like, there is a strong demand for historical houses, and people fall in love with them. So if it's the third generation or whoever's living in that house, if they're smart, they'll go take out a loan of however X amount of money and make it more historical, register it on the Mills Act, and sell it for twice as much. And so it's more of a stimulus than a deterrent.
Well, you have to consider that if it's a generational home, their property taxes are already very, very low. And someone that,
Depends.
speaking for myself, where I would consider myself an expert in building materials, it's very expensive to restore a home. So regardless of a Mills Act, discount on your property taxes, it's still very expensive.
Again, it's not mandatory.
I completely understand.
There's no stick in here.
And that's why when this comes back, that scope has to be
I got
very
it.
narrow.
I know we have a very short period of time, and I've been waiting for 2 years. I would like to go through the next ones. It'd be great.
Can I say one thing about the Mills Act, just so you guys know? And Wes already knows this, but it's changed. The discount for Mills Act isn't what it used to be. Like, I think we got 3 or 4 emails saying, "What happened?" And the county doesn't give as big a tax break as they used to, just so you know.
Thanks, Tom. Not helping, but.
So, hold on one second. So, Mr. Eastman, I think that there's sufficient direction for A and B, and the rest of it, I can tell, is going to be longer conversation.
I don't think so. I really don't. I mean, C is
Yeah.
going to be a big deal.
I'm going to suggest that I'm going to move that we cut this into a separate study session in order to complete the other 3 items.
Or can we bring it to a council meeting so it doesn't have to wait a whole month?
Yeah, we could probably do that. And that's not really a motion that I can make. I think I could just say that, right?
Yeah, at this point, all we're getting is direction, and so if what the consensus is some direction for staff to bring this to the next available council meeting, we can do that. And in the meantime, we've given us some direction on items A and B in the meantime.
Excellent. So, thank you. That's what we'll do. We'll bring it back to an earlier city council meeting for the remaining items. And the next meeting is going to be the city council meeting tonight at 6:30 in the chambers. Meeting is adjourned.